Firstly, can I just thank everyone for giving up a big chunk of time in the middle of what I'm sure is a really busy working day to come and learn a little bit more about C-Gull. It's really great to see so many people here from such a mixture of stakeholders and partners in the C-Gull grant, so thank you so much. I'm Louise Kenny, for those of you who don't know me or haven't met me in the real world before, and that's quite a lot of people at this stage, I think, in the pandemic. And I, amongst other things, am the Executive Pro-Vice Chancellor of the Faculty of Health and Life Sciences at the university down the road. And I'm delighted to be here with Professor Ian Buchan, who'll be talking after me. We're here today, though, as co-investigators in the C-Gull birth cohort programme, which you're here to learn more about. I'm hoping that some of our other co-investigators may join us over the course of the presentation as well. So I'm going to talk very briefly, hopefully, about the cohort, and then Ian's going to talk about some of the exciting things that we're doing around data linkage, which will make the cohort possible. So just by way of general background, I thought it might be helpful, because I know this is a very mixed audience, and for some people this is going to be your bread and butter. You will know this, the inside out of this, but for others this might be relatively newish information. And I think, you know, whenever I present this, I always try to imagine what someone who's outside of our specialty or outside of the area would ask. And I think it's a really valid question. Why do we need cohorts? What do cohorts teach us? So this picture in the middle is a city up here on the northeast coast of America called Framingham. And it's really quite famous in epidemiology and public health circles, because back in the late 40s, early 50s, the Framingham Heart Study commenced. And this was a cohort study of initially about 5,000 male citizens of Framingham who were intensively studied. There was a huge amount of data taken about them and their lifestyle and their medical history, and they were intensively followed up. In fact, they're still under follow-up. At this point now, their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren are still being studied. And through this study, it was called the Framingham Heart Study, we learned a huge amount. For example, we learned that cardiac mortality, death by cardiac events, myocardial infarction or heart failure, was driven by risk factors which we hadn't really understood before, and specifically their high blood pressure, high cholesterol, unhealthy eating, smoking and physical activity. Now, to us, I'm sure everyone knows that if I asked anyone on the street what increases your risk of a heart attack, most people would know that. It's like, absolutely, you know, as clear as night follows day these days. But bizarrely, back in the 50s when this study started, we didn't know that. We've discovered that largely from Framingham and from a lot of other looky-likey studies that followed in the wake of Framingham. And because of that data, we were able to develop interventions. The Framingham risk score is one of them. That's a score that doctors use to look at any individual's risk of having a cardiac event. But also, interestingly, proper medical interventions which have been proven to work, like low-dose aspirin and statins. The work on low-dose aspirin and statins and weight loss and physical activity purely came out of Framingham in a series of landmark papers that were published in hugely impactful medical journals. And the net effect overall is that since the 1950s to now, there's been a 60% reduction in cardiac mortality, which is amazing when you think about it. The numbers of lives saved and the numbers of ill health years lived that have been reduced by this simple cohort study of 5,000 individuals, which has like blossomed and provided this huge resource for the entire world. There is a little bit of a caveat, though. Back in the 1950s, when the cohort was established, it was 5,000 men that were recruited to the Framingham Heart Study. There were a handful, literally 2% of the original cohort were women. Now, happily, that's been corrected in more recent iterations of this cohort. But consequently, all the things that we learnt in Framingham about cardiac risk factors, about how to screen for cardiac disease, why statins and aspirin work, they work beautifully in men. And they don't have the same effect in women. And that's why we are in the unfortunate position now. This is a slightly old graph, but unfortunately the data is actually bizarrely even worse than it was at the turn of the millennium. We've got deaths from cardiac events going down in males massively, and yet deaths from cardiac events in women are going up. And that's because all the information that we learnt from Framingham is very gendered and it doesn't work in women. and women were missing from the cohort. So cohorts are really important, but they need to look like the population that you're seeking to serve. So we're doing a birth cohort, which is slightly different to what they did in Framingham, which was to recruit a bunch of adults. And we're doing a birth cohort largely, if not solely, because of this man, Professor Sir David Barker. In 1989, when I was an A-level student, first-year medical student actually, he published a paper that fundamentally changed our thinking. He previously noticed this really odd correlation that the poorest regions of England and Wales, and this is a generic bit in the Midlands that's a poor area, had the highest rates of heart disease. Now again, this is only 1989, but that actually fundamentally changed the way we thought about cardiac disease. Because prior to this, heart disease was thought to be a disease of excess and affluence. Everyone's familiar with Henry VIII. I think he finally popped his clogs of heart failure after a very affluent life. And that actually, back in the 80s, was what we thought heart disease was. It was a disease of excess. But David Barker's observation fundamentally turned that on its head. And this paper that was published, and it's a series of papers, but the landmark paper that I'm referring to here was published in The Lancet. And it was a very simple, really elegant paper that even I think the 19-year-old me could have understood back in 1989. And this led to a whole sphere of research called DOAD, or the Developmental Origins of Health and Disease. Because after that seminal observation about poverty and birth weight and heart disease, David Barker also noticed that poor nutrition in pregnancy led to a high number of babies being born small, presumably because they were malnourished in the womb. And that in itself was associated with cardiac disease. And again, this was a paper published in pretty short order, in about the same time frame as the observation around poverty. And you can see here the risk of cardiac mortality going up in babies that are born small. So this prompted the theory that in utero starvation, for want of a better word, preferentially causes the fetus to protect its vital organs, and the most vital organ that a fetus has is its brain, by skimping on the supply to other organs. And David Barker's hypothesis was this is a debt that is paid for decades later in the form of a weakened heart. And there's a series of papers here, all published in high-impact journals throughout the 80s, 90s, and into the noughties, pulling data together that really supports this hypothesis. So you can see here on the right is a term baby. This baby was born after 40 weeks of pregnancy, but it weighed 1.5 kilo. This is the archetypal, stereotypical baby that we always think of when we think of babies that are born with growth restriction, that have been starved in the womb. You can see that they've got a very big head to body ratio. They've got really skinny tummies because they've not laid down any fat and any glycogen in their liver, and they've got very loose skin. And this baby has been starved in utero, but developmental plasticity has meant that it's fine-tuned the gene expression of the baby to produce a really hardy, wiry baby that will then be suited to its environment after birth, a hardy environment with not much nutrition, etc. And if a baby with that phenotype is matched to its environment, the child actually remains healthy. So babies like this that are born into relatively malnourished populations actually do quite well. They not only survive, but they thrive. But when a baby that has been wired in the womb for a hardy environment postnatally is born to actually an environment that is a complete mismatch, it's a Western environment with no food scarcity, their ability to respond to environmental change is actually really compromised. And we end up with huge amounts of childhood obesity. And then in later life, that leads to a huge amount of cardiac disease and other metabolic indices and increased mortality rates. And this is the central tenet of the developmental origins of health and disease. And for many decades, it actually really focused specifically and almost exclusively on catch-up growth, obesity, and then cardiovascular disease, because they were the original observations of David Barker. And of course, from a public health perspective, these are really important issues, because you can look at the maths and model, and Ian is more of an expert on this than I am, but we estimate that about 50% of the men and women, but let's focus on men because that's what Framingham taught us. 50% of the men that are currently sitting in Liverpool Heart and Chest with cardiac disease of various types are there not because of a genetic risk and not because of their environment or because they've been sedentary or any of the things that we think of. They're there purely because their first 1,000 days, and specifically their life in utero, has led to them being maladapted for the environment they were then born into. 50% of that disease burden, it is absolutely massive. But since that time, like 2 decades later, the sort of Barker hypothesis is now completely mainstream. It's supported by thousands. If you Google Barker hypothesis or you PubMed it, you will get thousands of hits. And it's backed up by studies in humans and in animal models, in registry work from big national registries, which all link a hostile in utero environment to heart disease, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, stroke and obesity. And for a lot of that time, we've thought, well, that's it. It's metabolic disease. We've cracked it. We just need to think about things that will intervene. Because for the whole of that time, we thought that the brain was spared. This concept of brain sparing has been central to the hypothesis. But actually, in recent decades, or in recent years, new questions have arisen, like, is the brain really spared? The brain is actually, after all, a really sensitive organ. We know that when it's developing the womb, it's uniquely sensitive to the environment. So is it truly spared? Is it just in utero starvation that causes intergenerational effects, or are there other things that can happen in the environment that contribute to developmental programming? So what if a baby isn't actually starved in the womb, but mum, for example, is really stressed, or there are other toxins or other environmental pressures? And we've even started to wonder whether the mother's mental state actually affects the way in which her physical state adapts to pregnancy, and in particular, how she nourishes baby in utero. And that really goes back to something that really is as old as the history of modern man. We often believe that we are what we eat, we are what our mother ate, we are what we feel, and we are what our mothers felt. And this is quite an ancient depiction of a general belief in ancient societies that we are what we eat, which is why in pregnancy, which is why women were often confined and protected and nurtured during pregnancy, because there was a definite recognition even back, in ancient times, that pregnancy could influence the unborn baby in a way that we didn't really understand. So that's, in a nutshell, why we need birth cohorts. And happily, the UK is one of the leading countries in the world in terms of establishing birth cohorts. The first and probably best known birth cohort was the MRC National Survey of Health and Development, which began immediately after the war in 1946. And it followed 5,000 people who were born across the UK in a single week in 1946. And those people that are still alive are still under active follow-up. The National Child Development Study, the 1958 birth cohort, came later. And you'll see that there was a big jump in the number of people being followed from 5,000 to 17,000, because within that 10, 12-year gap, we realised that actually, in order to look at some of the rarer outcomes that we've been talking about, you need more people in a cohort. So they made an attempt to capture a lot more data from a lot more people. And then in the 1970s, the British Cohort study followed 17,000 people born across England. Similar model, everyone born in a single week in 1970 were followed up. And then in the early 90s, there was a sort of turnabout in how we thought about birth cohorts, because the first 3 cohorts on this slide were all about data. They were all about questionnaires and data and capturing as much information as possible about health and well-being in the environment. But they lacked measurements. They lacked hardcore physical measurements of the participants, and in particular, they lacked biological samples. That all changed with the advent of the Elsback Study, the Avon longitudinal study of parents and children, shortened to Elsback, which was originally known as Children of the 90s, but now is known worldwide by the acronym Elsback. And this followed 14,000 people born in the former county of Avon, which now doesn't actually exist. So we've got an Avon study for an area that actually doesn't exist on the map anymore. But it actually is run out of the University of Bristol. It's still going. It's funded by the MRC and by Wellcome. And I'm actually fortunate enough to be reviewing the Elsback cohort in a couple of weeks for, I think, their something like 20th year of funding. It has led to an enormous quantity of data, some landmark discoveries, If we've got time, we can touch on them briefly. At the start of this millennium, we also launched the Millennium Cohort Study, or Children of the New Century, which is following, again, 19,000 kids born across the UK over a one-year period at the turn of the millennium. And that is a very data-intense study, again, largely lacking biological samples, but significant because of its size of 19,000. But they are actually, just to go back, there's also another study called Born in Bradford, which I couldn't fit onto the slide. The Born in Bradford study was founded just after the Millennium study in the early noughties. And that's a really important study because it is all about children born in Bradford, which is a very ethnically diverse population. And that was founded in response to the fact that these former cohorts were largely very white and did not reflect British society as it looks in the new millennium. And the Born in Bradford cohort, which we are also partnered with in our study, has been a landmark study for showing that actually ethnicity really does matter, in addition to all the other things we've ever studied. But Born in Bradford is between 15 and 20 years old now. There hasn't been a new cohort since. And there are several reasons for that. One of the reasons is they're really hard to do, and they're very, very expensive. There have been attempts over the last 15 years to establish new national cohorts. There was an attempt a few years ago to do a big national cohort, very similar to the cohort we're about to share with you, except it was across multiple sites throughout the UK. It was called the Life Study. It was an incredibly ambitious attempt to establish this huge national resource. But because it was so complex, it actually failed. And as a consequence, a significant amount of time, energy, and money was actually wasted in the end trying to establish this cohort. And it was a really bad thing for cohorts overall because the funders were very disappointed. Researchers who've been working on it were clearly very disappointed. And for someone like me who's got an interest in both cohorts, I thought it really meant that any possibility of establishing a new cohort had been set back by at least a decade, possibly more. But we were delighted, Ian, myself, David Taylor-Robinson, Helen Sharp, a bunch of other colleagues, too many to mention actually, there's a huge number of people working on this. About 4 years ago now, one dark winter's night, saw a call on the Wellcome Trust website and thought we might actually have a chance of establishing a new cohort in Liverpool. And the long story short is that's exactly what we've done. We wrote a grant to Wellcome, and happily it was funded. And the aim of our cohort really is to do something that other cohorts haven't done or not done as well as we hope to do in our cohort. And specifically, that's to connect some very rich scientific hypotheses and some very rich biological and molecular data with our civic data and in a civic construct to identify not only risk factors and trajectories, but also how they interact to increase a child's risk of not only non-communicable diseases like diabetes, asthma, and cancer. We know that these are influenced by childhood experiences, but the causal mechanisms, how that actually happens, still remains to be fully unravelled. But critically, mental health. Other cohorts have really only skimmed over mental health. Some of the cohorts that are still going are now trying to retrofit mental health work into their cohorts to have a look at childhood risk factors. But it's always really tricky trying to collect data 20 years after it's actually happened. Obviously, if you ask a child who's, well, it's an adult now in the Born in Bradford cohort, what were you thinking or feeling when you were 5? I can barely remember what my pet hamster was called when I was 5. I can't tell you what I was feeling or what was influencing, my childhood. So it's tricky. You have to do that data in real time. And I think because other cohorts have not really looked at mental health, and because we all recognise now the importance of mental health and the fact that we are looking down the barrel of a significant mental health challenge in this country, we've made one of the central foci of our cohort mental health. What influences it, what enhances it, and critically what actually detracts from a healthy mental health. And we also want to look at children's abilities in the round. We want to look at developmental outcomes and educational difficulties. We know we have issues in our region with things like school readiness. And we knew that back in 2018 when Ian and I wrote the grant, but the pandemic has made those huge challenges far worse. We already had significant societal gaps, particularly in our region, and unfortunately they've become wider, not narrower, during the pandemic. So that's the aim. So what are we going to do? We are going to recruit 10,000 firstborn infants and their parents in triad design. And unlike the life study, the study I mentioned which failed, we're going to do it out of one centre, and it's this centre, the Liverpool Women's. And there's a reason for that. A, it makes it logistically a lot easier and more feasible. B, we think Liverpool's a really special place. We think that if we launch this study and we've co-created it with our parents and our community, they'll take this study to their heart and participate for years. And we really need them to participate for years. We need the people of Liverpool to own this study and feel that this is something from them, for them, but also for the wider world. And I think you can do that in Liverpool. I say that as a Scouser. I think we have that community spirit and engagement in Liverpool in a way that you don't have in other cities. Sure, you could do this in Newcastle and you could do it in Manchester, but I don't think you'll get the buy-in that I think we're going to get in Liverpool. I've always been convinced of that, and I've managed to convince Wellcome of that as well, so let's hope I'm right. But also, it means that we will get some really specific Liverpool data. And I've touched on it, and I know that Ian is going to talk about this in a bit more detail, but we have real problems in Liverpool. We have huge unmet health needs. We have significant socioeconomic divides. It is fundamentally not right that you lose 12 years of healthy living as you travel across the Merseyrail network. That divide is greater in Liverpool than it is in any other city. It's a problem, but I think through this cohort, we can really unravel the impact that problem is having on our citizens. So we're going to recruit over 3 to 4 years. The birth rate's going down, and it's gone down a bit more since we wrote this study. So we do need to hit very high levels of engagement. We reckon about 70% of eligible mums will need to take part. This study will be led by our own clinical research team, and I'm delighted that a lot of them are in the audience today. And at the moment, we're funded to study the kids until they're 2. But in funding the cohort, Wellcome and other funders recognised that they were really giving a commitment to continue to fund this cohort, because it would be a huge waste of the nearly £10 million that we've raised to establish this cohort if it all ended when the kids were 2. But we live in uncertain times, and Ian is going to address what happens if the unthinkable happens and we're not funded to study them anymore. There is a plan B. And I'm not going to talk about that in any detail, other than to say that it rests in this really important resource, the Civic Data Co-op. You're going to hear a bit more about this in a minute, but this, I think, is the resource that will set our cohort apart from all the others and will enable us to do what others have tried and unfortunately haven't been able to. So, in order to be eligible, you need to be over 16. It needs to be your first ongoing pregnancy, and you need to be booked for care at the Liverpool Women's. You can be booked for home birth, you can be booked for community care, you can be booked in any care model that the hospital offers. You just need to be booked at the Women's. We'll consent in early pregnancy, and we're going to collect a lot of data and samples at 2 time points in pregnancy. Around the end of the first trimester, early second trimester, we're not being very strict about that, and in the very early third trimester, in the hope that we will capture as many women as possible at both time points. We have a separate pathway for dads, and of course not every family is configured that way these days, so we'll be taking lots of information from all caregivers of children who consent to take part in our study, and we hope that anyone who has any influence on these kids will agree to take part, because their input is also equally valuable. In the postnatal period, we're going to see kids at 3 months and 12 months, and we possibly will see them a bit more frequently. All that depends on funding and whether we get more grant income to support this. But we're obviously really interested in how these children develop, and there's a whole team of people working on the postnatal protocol as I speak, deciding what state-of-the-art investigations and questionnaires and assessments we can use to track these children. And obviously this is a massive community effort, so there's going to be a big outreach team. We're starting with engagement activities, and this is one such activity, to ensure that all stakeholders, and then critically all women and their families, can participate. We get asked a lot of questions about the biological samples, because we live in a really tech-savvy area and everyone's aware of the power of DNA now, so I thought I'd preempt some of them by just describing what we want to take. So firstly, the important thing is you can take part in the study without giving us samples. We don't want anyone to feel that a reluctance to give us biological samples excludes them from the study. But having said that, we hope that all mums, dads, babies and caregivers will take part and give freely of biological samples. They will continue to own their samples. They can withdraw them at any point from our biobank. We're simply the custodians. And anything that is done on those samples will be done in consultation with a group of women and other participants in the study who will provide input on the ethos and acceptability of the research questions that we're trying to address. We hope to take blood and RNA and DNA from that blood from mum. We're also interested in urine, the placenta, the baby's placenta, and hair. And I can talk about hair if anyone wants to know why hair, but it's a really good resource. From dads, we're hoping just to take some DNA. We know that a lot of dads really don't like having needles unnecessarily. So we'll take it from a saliva sample or from blood if they're happy to give that. And from babies, we'll hope to take blood at the time of their birth, as well as a biopsy of their placenta. All the samples will be processed and stored in the academic labs at the university down the road after they've been processed here in a bespoke set of labs in the research centre. And they'll all be traced and stored securely for the duration of this study. And as I said, we will be the custodians, but the data from those samples and those samples themselves will still belong to the study participants. This is just a schematic showing how babies and their families will progress through the study. You can see the first time point at the top in early pregnancy, and where the study currently is funded to at 24 months. But as I say, I am hopeful that the next time I talk about this study in about 6 weeks' time, we'll have had good news about further follow-up. The governance of this is critical. So we do have things like an independent scientific advisory board populated by some of the most leading thinkers in this area, people who've done cohort studies before internationally, people who've published really landmark papers, people who think differently about some of the societal challenges that we're facing at the moment, and they're all, we are delighted, on our scientific advisory board. We have an investigator group, some of us are here today. We've also started to construct a research access committee because this is a resource that we want to share with the world. When I said a few moments ago, we want this to be from Liverpool, for Liverpool, but also it's a gift to the wider international scientific community because this resource is going to be utterly unique, almost priceless. And we're certain that from the minute we start to advertise it, we'll be inundated with requests from across the globe for access to data and for collaborations. And we want to be open, we want to share it. This isn't something that we're going to mind like Gollum's ring. This is for the world. But we need to make sure that all that work that we do in partnership fits with the ethos of the study and has the approval of the participants. So we've started to think about how we will govern that with a research access committee and an appropriate process. And for anyone who's interested, we've just listed the steps here, but there's further details available on our website. So, in terms of the timeline, I should have been having this talk with you about 2 years ago, as Kathy knows, but something happened. The study was funded, I think, in the late summer of 2018. So we spent the autumn getting really excited and making plans, and then just after New Year of 2020, 2020, the pandemic hit, and everything got iced. These are really complex studies. It's difficult enough to launch a birth cohort, but doing it in the middle of a pandemic was just a step too far. So that's why you might have heard about C-Gull for a while now and wondered whenever it was going to happen, but we had to ice it because of the pandemic. So we're finally launching in autumn of 2022. There's more information on our website. There is a special email box if you're interested, and our senior program manager, Dr. Jane Harold, I'm going to embarrass you now. Jane, can you wave? I'm standing at the back. Jane is a great source of information if you've got questions about the study. But I'm always delighted to chat about C-Gull, as is Ian, any of our co-investigators, and Dr. Christine Cornforth, who's also in the audience, has been instrumental in getting us to where we are now. I'm going to stop and hand over to Ian. There are a huge number of people to thank, though, and I will forget to do it at the end of the questions. So, and I probably will forget someone now, but I really do want to thank the Liverpool Women's. Kathy's here today. It's great to have Kathy's support. I actually do genuinely believe that the Liverpool Women's is one of the few places in the country we could do this study in this time frame with the funding that we've got and deliver something as special as what I think we're about to do. I don't think there's anywhere else that would take this study on with the enthusiasm and generosity and passion that we've met with everyone throughout the hospital. And that comes from the top, so thank you, Kathy. And I also want to thank our CRN colleagues. So Chris is here today. The CRN, when I first mentioned this, Chris looked at me as if I'd grown a second head out of my shoulder. I think it's fair to say. I remember the conversation because he said, so that'll be 30,000 people, because it's obviously mums, dads and babies. But the CRN have been unstinting in their support. Nothing has been too much. They've been incredibly enthusiastic and generous and supportive. And again, thank you, Chris. And all my co-investigators who have been amazing. So I'm going to stop and hand over to Ian, who's got a different set of slides. And then I think at the end of Ian's talk, we're both happy to take any questions.